In 2012, the owner of the largest digital game store called the newest version of the dominant operating system a catastrophe. He saw a walled garden coming that could cut his company out. The first response was a hardware line with native support for roughly 100 games. It flopped. The second response came 6 years later. Instead of asking developers to rewrite their games, the company funded a decades-old open-source project that re-implements the dominant system's programming interfaces and bolted on a translation layer that converts one graphics standard into another. That project now runs 80% of the store's library on an operating system it was never built for. It also cannot run the biggest competitive titles because the companies behind those games refuse to flip a switch that already exists. The compatibility layer is not a single tool. It is a stack of components developed by different people and acquired through a combination of hiring, contracts, and open source contribution. The base is a project that has been re-implementing the dominant operating system's interfaces since 1993, originally as a volunteer effort with no corporate backing. The company behind the distribution platform hired the commercial firm that employs many of that project's core developers and funded them to accelerate work specifically on gaming. A separate developer created a translation layer that converts one generation of the graphics standard into the cross-platform alternative as a hobby project in 2017. The company hired him too. A fork of another translation project handles the newest generation of the graphics standard. Audio re-implementation, font rendering, and game-specific patches round out the stack. When a game works, all of these layers function together invisibly. When a game breaks, any one of them could be the cause, and identifying which requires knowledge most users do not have. The handheld gaming device the company launched in 2022 changed the trajectory. Millions of units running the custom operating system meant the compatibility layer was no longer an experiment. It was the foundation of a hardware product line. Development accelerated. Compatibility climbed from roughly half the library to 80%. A rating system categorized titles as fully working, playable with issues, unsupported or untested. The device became the single most significant driver of gaming on the platform the compatibility layer targets. Early versions of the compatibility layer had a documented problem with save game synchronization. The fake environment it creates uses different file paths than the real operating system, and the cloud synchronization service expected the real paths. Users lost hours of progress to mismatched saves. The problem was largely fixed by 2023, but the edge cases persist with modified titles and certain older games where the path handling was never updated. The anti-cheat problem is the wall the project cannot break through on its own. Competitive multiplayer games use kernel-level protection systems that detect modified environments. Two of the largest providers announced support for the alternative platform in 2021 after the company worked with them directly. The technical solution exists. Developers simply need to enable it. Many refuse. The largest competitive shooter from one of the biggest publishers says it will never support the platform. A major looter shooter with millions of active players refuses to enable it. One of the most popular battle royale games does not work despite being published by the company that owns the anti-cheat middleware it uses. That same company's leadership has made public statements expressing skepticism about the platform's viability. The decision is commercial and political, not technical. The middleware works, the checkbox exists. The developers choosing not to tick it are blocking handheld device owners and desktop users alike from titles that account for some of the highest concurrent player counts in the industry. For anyone whose primary game falls into this category, the compatibility layer solves everything except the one thing they actually need it for. The handheld device that made the platform viable for millions of new users ships with no way to play these titles and no prospect of that changing unless the developers decide it should. The graphics hardware divide is the other persistent friction. Systems using the open source driver stack from one major vendor achieve 90 to 100% of the performance the same hardware delivers on the dominant operating system. Systems using the proprietary driver from the other major vendor lose significantly more, with reports documenting a 45% performance drop in titles using the newest graphics standard. The cause is a translation overhead, where the newer graphics standard's memory management model does not map cleanly to the cross-platform alternative, and the proprietary vendor's driver handles that translation less efficiently. The open source vendor's driver lives inside the kernel, and the graphics middleware is optimized specifically for the compatibility layer's workload. The proprietary vendor's driver is closed source, less optimized for this use case, and produces worse results under the same conditions. The practical recommendation in 2026 is that one vendor's hardware works measurably better than the others for this purpose, which is not something the compatibility layer can fix because the bottleneck is in the driver, not the translation. Every update to the compatibility layer improves compatibility for dozens of titles and breaks a handful of others. Users who depend on a specific title working pin the version that last ran it correctly and avoid updating. A community fork maintained by a single developer adds patches the company will not include, ships faster than the official releases, and is widely recommended across forums and discussion threads when the official version does not work. The naming across stable, experimental, hotfix and community versions creates enough confusion that a recurring question in community spaces is which version to use for any given title. Modding adds another layer. Modification managers designed for the dominant operating system assume file paths and system calls that do not exist in the translated environment. Some modifications work after manual configuration, others that require kernel-level access or depend on framework components. The translation layer handles inconsistently simply do not function. Community guides exist for the most popular modified titles, but the process is never as straightforward as it would be on the system the games were built for. Proton, for anyone who wants the largest library of games designed for a different operating system to run on the platform without waiting for developers to rewrite them, where 80% of the distribution platform's catalog works without configuration, where the handheld device it powers has made gaming on this platform a mainstream activity rather than a niche experiment, and where the corporate funding behind it means development will continue as long as the hardware product line generates revenue, accepting that the biggest competitive titles are blocked by developers who refuse to enable existing anti-cheat support, that the proprietary graphics vendor's hardware suffers measurably worse performance than the open source alternative, that every update risks breaking titles that previously worked, that a community fork maintained by one person is often recommended over the official version, that modification support ranges from functional to impossible, depending on the title and the tools involved, that the entire project exists because a private company needs independence from another private company and would likely deprioritize it if that strategic need disappeared, and that the compatibility layer solved the library problem but created a culture where developers stopped building for the platform natively because the translation is considered good enough. The tool that made gaming viable on an operating system it was never supposed to work on. Whether that is liberation or a dependency that looks like freedom is the question nobody involved has an incentive to answer honestly. Every choice is a trade-off. At least now you know what you're trading.